Good evening, church family. It is good to join you on this Wednesday evening for Pastor's Bible Study. This week, we are going to be bringing a conclusion to the end of our study of the pastor as a church member. Back in November, I began to walk you through really my dissertation. And we looked at everything from understanding of church membership to church discipline, discussions about how a church is, the nature of the church through its metaphors. The metaphor that's used to describe the pastor's connection, his role to the church, through the pastor as a shepherd and the church as a flock of sheep. And we spent a lot of time working through these issues. The last couple of weeks we've gotten a little bit more practical. We looked at how the pastor should view his role differently in the light of the fact that he is a church member and not simply an employee of a local church. Last week we looked at how the church should view the pastor's role differently in that same light. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of bring everything to a conclusion. We're going to look at 7 implications, some practical things that could be done that should change in our churches. Some of our churches may be doing some of these already. And so if they are, then certainly they should be enhanced, or they should be maybe done with renewed vigor when we understand the role of the pastor as a member of the body and not just an employee, and not just a hired hand. So we'll look at those, and then we'll just kind of close out with a look at how I concluded the paper. Good news is, just this morning I received confirmation from the PhD office that my dissertation has passed to the next stage, to the defense. And so, God willing, I will stand before a couple professors on Tuesday, March the 9th, and we'll go over some of the same things I've gone over with you, except certainly in a whole lot shorter time frame, address their concerns or issues with the paper. And like I said, the Lord willing, we'll be on the path to completing this chapter of my life that the Lord called me to. Almost 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago this week. So here we go. Today, the practical implications of the pastor's church membership. And the bottom line is, what I see is, if the church and the pastor both come to a better understanding of the connection that the pastor has with the local body, he's not just a hired hand, he's not just an employee, then his job description and his role and his function within the church and within the community is going to be much deeper, much more connected. There should be a greater appreciation and love for the pastor as a part of the family, a part of the body, a part of that local people of God at work in the community. And so the first of the 7 implications, or 7 practical applications, would be this: that someone in the church, or someone's in the church, when a pastor first comes to the church, should make it their objective, their goal, to help the pastor come to understand and learn and grow in the fabric of the body of the community. Certainly, a pastor is going to have a pretty good idea, especially if he's experienced, if he's pastored before, of how he wants to go about his daily routine, his Bible study time, how he'll handle appointments and maybe counseling and those kind of things. And maybe that'll grow in the new church. But what he won't know is he won't understand the fabric of the community. He won't know who the leaders are, who the godly men and women are that he can trust. Certainly, he's probably going to lean on those who were on that search committee who called him to begin with. They're probably on that committee because of the fact that they are leaders in the church. But he's not going to know the fabric of the community. He's not going to know who the leaders are, who the businessmen are, who he needs to get to know. And so, one thing that could happen is a couple godly deacons could take that pastor under his wing and could help introduce him. Show him where the nursing homes are that he's going to have to go visit. Let him know where some of the elderly ladies are that are widows that need his care, and so that he can get a good start watching over them. Maybe even help him have a little bit of warning for those who are going to need extra care. So a couple godly leaders in the church could go a long way to helping that pastor get off on the right foot. And understanding that he's a member of this body that we hope is going to be here a long time, and this is important. Second, when a church understands that its intimate connection to its shepherd, it's also going to want to take care of that shepherd. Now this goes to, first and foremost, compensation, that the church cares for the pastor in a way that it meets his needs, the needs of him and his family. That may be different for different pastors, and it's certainly going to be different in different communities, in different churches. Scripture speaks of the fact that a pastor who is able to teach, who is a godly leader, should be compensated, should be paid, especially if the church is expecting the pastor to make a living wage. The church needs to make sure that they take care of that. And here's the bottom line of it. If the church sees a pastor who loves them and is committed to becoming a part of that church family, and the church understands that he's part of the family, they're going to want to take care of him, just like they would other family members. Third, Jesus, as he spoke of the special connection that the pastor had with his sheep, spoke of this intimacy that he had with his sheep. In John 10 we looked at this. He says that the good shepherd speaks and the sheep know his voice, and he knows his sheep. And with that in mind, the practical onus here falls on the pastor himself. He needs to make a concerted effort to get to know his sheep. He cannot expect the church and the individual members of the church to respond to his leadership if he doesn't love them, care for them, and know them personally. He's not going to know when a sheep goes missing from the flock if he hasn't built relationships. And so pastor's job is going to be, as he gets started, to intentionally seek ways to build intimate connections with individual members in the church. Fourth, the church member, when the church understands that the pastor is now a part of the local body, they're going to intentionally welcome him into their community and in their lives. It's a little bit harder, especially in rural congregations where pastors historically have been short-term. There's an expectation that he's an outsider. In fact, oftentimes it may take years for a pastor to build the relationships that help him become an insider in the community. In the church, it should be a little bit easier, but it's still going to be tough. And some churches continue to see the pastor as the outsider. If he is going to be effective and function well as a shepherd, he has to be able to lead from the inside. And so the church needs to help facilitate those relationships. Practical ideas might be for individual church members to take that step of inviting the pastor and his wife and family into their home for a dinner, for an evening, for lunch after church. If a church member reaches out and seeks to build that relationship, that pastor is going to appreciate it, and that pastor is going to more easily fall in love and develop that connection with the church member. But the church needs to show their desire to integrate him into the family of the church. You know, one of the greatest things that when I first became pastor as a young man, 24 years old, I actually went to May, Texas as pastor in October. It was near the end of football season, and I had a deacon who would say, "Hey, why don't you and your wife come to the game with us? We'll pick you up and we'll drive you to the out-of-town game." He had a big van, and we would ride to the game to watch the local high school football team. And it said a lot to me about his desire to help me get ingrained in the fabric of the community. When I first visited, or when I first came here as pastor, the first week in the office at First Baptist Watauga, had a deacon that came by, picked me up, drove me around town, showed me where the nursing homes were, showed me where the hospitals were that I was going to need to go visit. He made it a point to help me get off on the right foot. He even introduced me to probably the eldest member of the church at the time, who was living in a nursing home. We stopped by to see her and introduced me to her. And he went out of his way to introduce me, as I said back in the first point, to areas and part of the community I needed to know. Whereas this deacon in May, he took us to the football game. We had others that would take us out for a meal. So as intentional as the pastor needs to be in developing relationships, if the church understands that pastor and his family are coming into they're the ones coming in as outsiders, it will go a long way for that superintendent of schools who was on that search committee to introduce me to people in the community that I needed to know and help me build relationships. So, fifth, the church is going to need to understand that this new pastor is going to be different than previous pastors. And when we see that the new pastor, that the pastor is a part of the local body, that we're wanting him to become a part of the family, we're gonna want to extend grace to him, recognizing that he's going to be different. And as we extend that grace, we recognize and desire that the church would accept him as a part of the family. They're going to be more willing to see that pastor through difficult times. There's going to come some times of disagreement and misunderstandings. Certainly. One thing I mentioned here is just the very fact that whatever the last pastor was, this pastor is not. He's going to have a different personality. He's going to have a different way of going about things. And if the church is willing to extend grace, you can make it through some of those ups and downs, those difficulties. Even allow the pastor to fail. If he makes a leadership decision that maybe you don't necessarily agree with, you've got to give the pastor some room to at least work through that. Now, I'm not talking about preaching false doctrine or something along those lines, but maybe the pastor decides to change the cleaning date or whatever it happens to be. The church is always clean on Saturday, and he feels like it's better to do it when the offices are open on Friday. Whatever. Sometimes those things can be molehills that are made into mountains, and we can extend, if the pastor can extend grace to the church and the church to the pastor, you can get through some of these difficult times up front. Sixth, how a pastor treated when he fails, and what I mean here is fails on a higher scale, should be characterized, or it should be, how we treat a pastor when he fails, it should be based upon the fact that he is a church member as well. Sometimes pastors will fail by making poor decisions. Sometimes pastors will fail because they're tired, they're weary, and they're worn down, and they haven't gotten a break. And so the church, who loves their pastor, will seek to help their pastor be successful. If he needs time off, they'll give him time off. If he needs a break, they'll find a way to give him a break. If he needs encouragement, they'll find a way to encourage him. And if a pastor fails morally, and there are times where a pastor may fail and disqualify himself from ministry. And it may be that he fails to the extent that he's disqualified for a short period of time until he can seek forgiveness, be renewed, be restored to ministry, or maybe that he fails mortally in such a way that disqualifies him forever from leadership, from ministry, according to the New Testament. In any of those cases, a good starting point for how a church deals with a pastor who fails is Jesus' instructions that he gives us in Matthew chapter 18 for church discipline. Remember, if the pastor is a church member, treat him like a church member. Go to him. If you've got a concern about the pastor, you go to him first. Just as Jesus said, if you see a brother who fails, who sins, who stumbles, you go talk to him about it. If he doesn't respond, take somebody else with you so that there's a witness of two or more who've talked to him. In that case, especially dealing with a pastor, it's probably wise to bring in another elder, pastor, or deacon to meet with the pastor. And then, if the pastor is still unwilling to respond, and he's unwilling to seek forgiveness and biblically humble himself, then the church may need to remove him from office. And but you're certainly not, at that point, you're not just removing him from office. There may come a point where you need to discipline him as a church member and suspend or remove his membership. So my point there is that if the pastor is a church member, the responsibility when the pastor fails morally or biblically, responsibility is on the church to deal with it. And that's maybe not always how things have been handled when we saw the pastor as an employee of the local church. And then seventh and finally, and I would not suggest that these are all of the implications. I think that if I were to write a book on this subject, I could come up with other implications of things that we might do better or change in light of the fact that we see the pastor as a member of the church and not just a hired hand. But seventh is that when it comes time for the pastor to leave a church, the Lord does move his pastors at times. According to the need of one church or another church, God in his sovereignty and in his wisdom may call a pastor to a new field, to a new flock. That should never be, well, first of all, it should never be a decision that originates with the pastor. I think that if a pastor is out looking for another flock simply because he wants to move up the chain of command or move up to a bigger church, I think that he is a poor pastor. I think he's functioning as a hireling. Pastor is called to a local church. He's a part of that local body. He should have that attitude. He should remain at that local church unless the Spirit of God begins to work in his heart or his life or in the church in some way to move him to a new church, to a new flock. And if and when that time comes that the Lord moves a pastor, it should be a heart-rending decision. It should not be easy. It won't be celebratory because you're leaving a family. You're leaving people whom you love. And the church family is losing a pastor whom they've loved and invested in. Now certainly in this study I'm talking about the New Testament ideal for what it means to be a church, what it means to be a pastor, what it means to be a part of a church family, a church body, the temple of the Holy Spirit at work in the local congregation. Now, we all know that there are dysfunctional churches and there are dysfunctional pastors. And those have to be dealt with. But let's look at the New Testament and say, how ought it be? And it ought to be that if God has called me to pastor these people for 6 years, 10 years, 12 years, 20 years, and at some point in his wisdom he chooses to move the pastor, it ought to hurt. It's going to hurt. You're leaving a family. You're moving to another community. That's going to hurt the church that the pastor left, but it ought to hurt the pastor as well. And so it ought to be done with great care. The pastor should earnestly, prayerfully, as he senses the Lord moving him through that process, he should prayerfully work with the leaders of both churches. Now some would say, well, you can't tell your church you're leaving until, right toward the end. Yes, you can. Because here's the bottom line. If I'm pastoring, when I was pastoring at May and God began to work, the first hint that God might move me, I called a lady in May who was a godly prayer warrior. And I had already told First Baptist Watauga, no, I ain't going. I don't feel led to. I'll pray about it, but I don't feel led to. I called this lady and asked her to begin to pray for me. And that's all she did. For months, for 2 months, 3 months, she just prayed. A couple months later, the church came back to me and said that they believed that I was supposed to be their pastor. I struggled with it, but I said, well, the Lord had told me, I felt like the Spirit had told me I needed to at least walk through that open door, so to speak. So as I shorten the story, what then happened was before I came to meet with the committee for the very first time, I went and had breakfast with my chairman of the deacons, who was a godly, godly man. Sat down with he and his wife at 5:30 in the morning for breakfast and told him where the Lord was leading. And I told him, I said, my prayer is that the Lord doesn't move us. My prayer is that I get to stay with my church family here, whom I love. But brother, you're a godly man. You're a spiritual man, and I want you to begin to pray with me. I trusted him because, see, I had a relationship with my church family. When we went to the next step, I knew that it was time to let more leadership in. So every deacon who had served with me, I felt like was worthy, that they deserved to hear it from me before I went for the second interview. And once again, I said, we don't know if that's where the Lord's going to take us for sure or not, but we should be praying about it because we know it's going to hurt us and it's going to hurt this church. So let's seek God's direction, because here's the bottom line, folks. You're godly men and women in the church who are seeking the Spirit of God. They're going to know. They're going to know if the pastor's leaving just to go to a field with more money or a higher position. They're also going to know if their pastor has a heart of a pastor. They're going to be trustworthy. And they're going to want what's best for their pastor. But here's the other side of it. Your spiritual leaders are also going to recognize that if a pastor stays beyond his calling, it's going to hurt their church. It's going to hurt them. And so local leaders will not want a pastor to stay, even no matter how much the folks at First Baptist Church May loved me. Many of them right off the bat said, no, you don't need to leave. We want you to stay here. But once they begin to pray and God began to speak to them, they said, Pastor, we love you and we don't want you to leave, but you have to. God's called. That's the way it ought to be. It ought to be a love relationship between the pastor and his church family, that certainly we put the Lord first. We put his calling first. But any time that God calls us to go separate ways, it ought to hurt. It ought to sting. But if we do it right, pastors, if we do it right, it'll be best for both churches. If we leave well, it can build up the church we're leaving. If we stay until God tells us to leave, it'll be best for the church we're at. I ended the dissertation with a simple conclusion. It's a story of a man named John Fawcett, who was pastor in England. And at the age of 26, he was pastor in a small rural congregation in Wainsgate, England, where he'd served for 7 years. He'd already been there a long time for a small church. His pastorate there started in 1765, and he received a call to move to a large, influential church in London. It made all the sense in the world. He'd been a good pastor. He'd served faithfully at this small church, and he got this call to a larger church, and it was time to go. They packed up their belongings. Everything was in their wagons. He preached his last sermon, and they got in their wagons to leave, and his wife cried out, John, I can't bear to leave. I don't know how to go. His response was, nor can I either. He ordered the wagons unpacked, and he said, we will remain with our people. He served in that small congregation for another 47 years, receiving a meager salary that never exceeded the equivalent of $200 per year. Years later, he remembered that event when he penned the words to a song that we still use in a lot of churches today. The song's titled, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. Many of you know the song. Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love. The fellowship of kindred minds is like to that above. Before our Father's throne we pour our ardent prayers. Our fear, our hopes, our aims are one, our comfort and our cares. We share our mutual woes. That's what a family's all about, right? Our mutual burdens bear, and often for each other flows a sympathizing tear. When we asunder part, it gives us inward pain, but still shall we be joined in heart and hope to meet again. What an incredible testimony of a man who stayed at a church, a small rural church, for 52 years because God called him to. He was a part of that church family, sharing their joys, sharing their fears, sharing their tears. Yeah, he had a chance to go make more money. And most of the people in the world on the outside would have looked at him and said he was a fool for not going. But praise God, 200 years later, we still hear that testimony through the song. My prayer is that as the Lord uses this work, this dissertation, certainly He's used it to touch me. And the Lord has brought into my life recently several young men who are going into pastoral ministry, who He's allowed me to mentor. But as the Lord uses this word, my prayer is that churches and pastors would grow, and we grow together in our understanding of what it means to be part of a family of God, to be united together, sharing our hopes and tears, our fears and our joys. That pastors learn not to just act like employees, and that churches quit treating them like it. We're not hired hands. We're shepherds. Pray that you've been encouraged by this study as I have. I know that we don't have a huge audience watching this, but God in His purpose and in His timing, He'll communicate the message to those who need to hear it. So God bless you. I hope that this helps you in your understanding of the relationship, at least, a pastor ought to have with his church and a church with a pastor. Look forward to seeing you Sunday in one of our services, either at 9 o'clock or at the 10:45 service. And if you're still not able to join us live, you can join us online in that 10:45 service. God bless you. Have a great night.